Hello, I'm Lizelle Sambury and welcome back to my channel where I talk about all things writing, traditional publishing, and a little bit of reading. And today we are revisiting my failures, which is to say I'm going to be talking all about the projects that I have shelved over the years, right from the beginning of the very first novel I wrote. And I thought this would be interesting to do and fun and a bit of a, I guess, a transparent look into the process, because I get a lot of questions from people about choosing ideas and how do I pick the right idea. And I feel from that a anxiety about not wanting to waste time and wanting to make sure that the idea I pick is this is the one that's going to be the one. And really, for me personally, I choose what ideas I want to make into full books based on how passionate I am about the idea. Sometimes I add a tiny bit of strategy to it, but mostly it's about just me being excited about the idea. And all of those ideas feel like they are the quote unquote right idea in the moment. And that isn't always how it works out, but there is, I feel like, different things to be taken from those shelf projects. And so I hoped that sharing this journey would kind of add a little bit of, I suppose, transparency and a different depth to that traditional publishing journey that I've had. Because I think sometimes also there's a feeling that, once you publish your book, then it's smooth sailing and every idea becomes a book. And that's also not necessarily the case. And so I hope this will provide, I guess, kind of a more well-rounded idea of my journey here on this channel. And yeah, maybe a little bit of comfort for those of you that are feeling really preoccupied about finding the right idea. So there are timestamps below if for whatever reason you want to jump around to the different projects. And let's go ahead and get started. My first shelved project was The Pack. So this was I was calling it a young adult fantasy, but all the characters were adults, so it was really an adult fantasy. But in any case, let's not get into the nitty-gritty of it. But this was about a woman who got caught up in a kind of conflict between werewolf royalty, and she ended up being forced to team up with a disgraced werewolf prince to help him take back his throne so that he can release her from being mixed up in all of this and having her life threatened. And they go on this epic journey through the forest, to get to this kind of werewolf royalty place. And so this was my first novel I'd ever written. I wrote it between 2007 and 2009. This was in the case when I mention these timelines, it's always kind of on and off. I rarely consistently work on something during that whole time. And so there are breaks in between, but it took me 2 years to get to a completed manuscript. So what went wrong? Many things. But I think first and foremost, I didn't know how to write a book. Really, I had just kind of sat down and written something, and then even more impactful, I didn't know how to revise a book. I thought revising a book meant I went through and made sure there weren't any typos, and that everything seemed pretty grammatically correct, and that was what I did. And then I sent it off. I queried 4 agents, and absolutely nothing came from it. Nobody got back to me. I also queried very, very poorly. I really didn't understand how to do a query letter. And so that was another kind of foible. And so altogether, I just kind of didn't understand the process. I didn't understand the process of revising a book. I didn't understand the process of querying. I just didn't get anything. And then when I didn't get any responses back and immediately become a best-selling author, I was crushed. I couldn't deal with it. And I was like, well, I guess this kind of isn't for me. And then I did come back to it. I didn't end up taking a break and coming back to it. And I tried to revise it. So this was kind of my first attempt at like doing actual revision. And so I went through my first chapter, I rewrote it, I switched different things around, and then I brought that chapter to my creative writing course, which was in itself its own mistake, because creative writing in university is very focused on literary. And up until that point, I had been writing adult literary short stories. And so it was very weird to then suddenly bring in a YA, wasn't YA, but YA fantasy and read that first chapter, and it was crickets in the room. And I was like, okay, well, this isn't for me. And that was when I really set down the project for good. So future plans for this. So I did end up doing something with this in a very kind of mild way, or like different way. And so essentially my newest novel that's coming out, A Mastery of Monsters, that will be coming out in 2025, is like a spiritual successor to this first book, in that I took the main character, so she has the same name, and I just pulled her into the new book. I made her a different character. She is actually a young adult this time. And I pulled the kind of idea of the male love interest, in that I created a brand new character that doesn't at all resemble that character, but there is an element of like being an outsider and being an outcast. And of course I didn't take in the werewolves. So I think I just don't picture myself writing a werewolf book in the future at all. I just don't think that I have the kind of wherewithal to reinvent it in a way that I would like. And so what I did with the Mastery of Monsters, instead of doing werewolves, I'm doing monsters. And to me, this felt like a fresh new take on what I'd wanted to do with the werewolves. And so I'm still getting to do all of these kind of like political machinations of like this society that is built around these creatures, but instead of a werewolf pack, it's monsters, a different sort of society. And it's of course now a dark academia, so it's set at a university, it's set at my alma mater, Queen's University, and I just really took elements of what I loved about the pack and I repackaged it and I recreated it into A Mastery of Monsters. And I'm very excited about the project finding its way in that sort of journey. The Light Witch was a YA portal fantasy. This was my second novel that I had written, and it was about a boy who fell into a well and ended up in a new world, which was a blatant Inuyasha reference, which I thought was fun, and I still think is fun. And he becomes embroiled in this world of addictive magic and trying to find his way back home. And so I wrote this, I worked on it from 2013 to 2014. So this was kind of the first book I'd written out of university. And then I queried it from, I imagine around that time, kind of 2014 to 2016, I think was when I finally was like, okay, this isn't working out. So I worked on it for 2 years and I queried it on and off for 2 years as well. So what went wrong? First and foremost, which I've talked about this book on this channel before, but it was problematic in many different ways. Essentially, I was trying to make a very diverse book in the wrong way, like without any real research, without any real sensitivity, without any real kind of depth of thinking around what I was doing. I fell into a lot of just like problematic representation pitfalls, like things that were like very common to, having a disabled character and having them go on a journey that essentially resulted to like curing their disability. And then later on, I realized that was problematic and I changed it. And I kept changing things, but it just ultimately, I didn't feel that it was my story to tell. And I didn't realize that until after I'd failed querying. So I spent 2 years on it. I spent 2 years to fail at querying. And then when I had some distance for the project, I realized, oh yeah, I just shouldn't have been writing this. And so this is definitely a project that I have no plans to come back to. It's not gonna happen. It's on the shelf and it is going to just stay there. But I think there are elements of it that I liked that I would maybe pull into a book in the future. So that element of addictive magic I did really like and think was interesting. There was also an element of a kind of like religious group involved in the magic, and I thought that was something that could be interesting to explore. And then there was also a kind of like an interrogation of like light and dark magic and those sorts of words being assigned. And I did actually take that. So that kind of exploration I actually took into Blood Like Magic, which was the book I wrote after this one, in talking about, you know, impure witches and pure witches. If you've read Blood Like Magic, you understand, but it's the idea of like designations based on morality and having a discussion about what it means when you do that, and like trying to put people into neat boxes. Yeah, and in that case, I actually actively avoided talking about light and dark because I do feel like there's some things in fantasy about like the association of like dark magic with dark-skinned people. And I wanted to circumvent that or avoid that in the book, and like talk about what I think is more interesting, which is like the idea of those morality levels, which I don't know if some fantasy was trying to get at, but like often did with strange racial tensions. Anyhow, so I did end up taking that into a different book. So I think that's kind of like where I see this project of like pulling elements out, but not recreating or going back to this story. The Infinite Blue was a YA epic sci-fi about two twin sisters living on a planet that has like a lot of bee-related kind of makeup and structure, and these girls are supposed to be coming into these leadership roles, but when their parents are kidnapped and held for ransom, they are forced to come into those roles earlier than expected. And at the same time, you are also following the point of view of a girl from Earth who has been brought to this planet for a specific purpose and is struggling with that. And that is The Infinite Blue. So I talked about this. I don't think I ever said the title before on the channel, but The Infinite Blue is that space opera, epic sci-fi that I had worked on for a little bit. So I worked on this from late 2018 to about May of 2019. And I was working on this while Blood Like Magic was on submission, and then later sold. So that was kind of the context of which I was working on it. And I didn't complete this. So I wrote the first act of it to show to my agent. And so where did things go wrong? So the first feedback I got from my agent, which I like died a little bit, but like, bless her soul, but she had mistakenly thought that the characters were like literal humanoid bees because of the way that I described things. So I had kind of like, their clothing consisted of things like wings, and it was like a sci-fi suit with like wings. And so I think because I hadn't described them well, or like made it clear that they looked like humans, she thought they were like weird humanoid bees, and she was like, I don't know how that's gonna go down in the market. And I like died of just like laughing because I was like, oh my gosh, no, that's not at all what is happening here. And I just like thought of her reading the whole first act, which I think was like 100 pages or something, reading 100 pages thinking they were giant humanoid bees. Oh man, I just, but that was on me because I hadn't done a good job of describing the characters. But they were also kind of just like, I really just felt like I didn't have the chops for it. And that was really difficult. Like I really wanted to work on it, but it was so huge. It was such an expansive world. I was building it based on the planets in the Milky Way galaxy solar system. And so I had to create a different kind of being for each planet. And I also had to get into like Earth had its own separate history, and then it had a history with the moon and blah, 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 blah. There was just like a ton of world building involved. And I really was just like, totally unprepared for that level of world building. I just hadn't had enough time to put everything together. And this was not the situation where like a lot of times I've kind of just jumped into a project and then I've world builded as I've been doing it. And I really just could not do that with this book. And it just like, I hadn't really worked it out. And so I ended up saying to my agent, I'm actually going to shelve this and like work on something different because I just couldn't make it happen. And so future plans for this project, I do really want to do this at some point. I am considering about making it adult. When I first suggested this to my agent, she was like, it kind of feels like it has a really YA voice. And so I think if I wanted to make it adult, I would have to rewrite it. I would have to change a lot of things. And I get what she was saying because the themes of it are very young adult, about like kind of coming into and discovering yourself for the first time, to me is a very young adult sort of theme. And I feel like the way they were poised, I totally understand why she said it. Like it feels like it's very young adult. So I would have to definitely like overhaul everything, but I'm tempted to do that, mostly because I feel like the adult market is more receptive to sci-fi than the young adult market. And I don't think that's because teens don't like sci-fi. I actually think teens really do like sci-fi. I think publishing does not understand what to do with sci-fi. And I find with young adult sci-fi, and I find that often young adult sci-fi is kind of not given the due that it deserves. Whereas I feel like there's more space and more acceptance of that within the adult sci-fi realm. And so I think if I go back to this project, I would reimagine it as an adult project, because I just feel like there's more support in publishing for adult sci-fi than there is for young adult sci-fi. But that makes it ever more harder, because if I was worried about my chops writing young adult sci-fi, it's even more in adult sci-fi. So I feel like I would need a lot of time to work on this. I feel like this would be the sort of thing where I'd have to be in a sort of like financial position to take a year off from anything else and just work on this, in order to give myself the base to be able to write something like this. And I think it'll probably be a little while before I'm in any sort of position of being able to do that. I would definitely be relying on a grant probably. And so I just think it would be a little bit of time before I could do that. So but I still really want to do it. I reread the pages like not even that long ago, and I'm still so in love with it. I do think there's so much about it that is like really good and I want to get into. I just need the time and space. Not the Chosen One was a young adult Caribbean-inspired high fantasy about a girl living in like a world in which your kind of caste is based on the animal that you are associated with and have a connection with, and she is part of the lowest caste, and then she becomes mistakenly named as the Chosen One, and she decides to trick the people into thinking she is the correct Chosen One, using whatever skill she can, so that she is able to elevate her entire caste to a sort of higher status. And so that's not the Chosen One. I just totally forgot how long I had worked on this. So I actually worked on this from 2018 to March of 2020. And I just fully, like, all of this just like escaped my brain until I went looking in my email because I wanted to see the timelines. And then I realized, so in 2018, when I was actually, querying agents, for what would become Blood Like Magic, Page Street YA, which is a publisher, they had put out this open call for submissions. And so you could put together a proposal and you could submit it to them. Your manuscript didn't have to be completed. You just needed the pitch letter, a synopsis, and the first 50 pages, and you could submit it to them and possibly get a book deal directly. And so because I'm that sort of person, I was anxious, I wanted something to do, I decided that I would put together a pitch and send it off to them. And I totally forgot also that I had actually paid, I believe Adeline Grace, who's the author of Belladonna and other books, was doing like editorial services. And so I actually paid for her to look through my whole package and like give me feedback. And I just fully forgot that I had done any of this stuff. But anyway, so I did that and I submitted it to Page Street YA. But then I signed with my agent, with Christy Hunter, and I talked to her about the fact that I had submitted this proposal, and I was like, what should we do? And she suggested that we pull it because she had a lot of belief in what would become Blood Like Magic, and she wanted it to be a true debut. So she wanted us to go forward with that and to like consider this other book for another time. And so I pulled it from submission from Page Street, and I basically kind of like set it down. And in between that time, I started working on The Infinite Blue. And so that's why I wanted to talk about that one first. But so then I basically kind of went to Christy and I was like, which project do you think I should work on? Like Not the Chosen One or The Infinite Blue? And she suggested that we work on Not the Chosen One. I also had suggested like, could we submit just the proposal? And she suggested that we would have a better chance if I wrote the full manuscript. So then I made the decision to write the full manuscript in May of 2019. And so that was like that May period to the 2020 period is when I was working on it. So let's go into what went wrong. So, this was kind of like a difficult project to begin with because I wanted to have a 15-year-old protagonist. I wanted to go into that, what I consider, I suppose, a bit of a no-fly zone in young adult in publishing. They like when your main character is like 16 or 17, even though 14 and 15 are also part of the teen experience. It's this very weird no man's land in which like middle grade is like 13, I guess like 9 to 13, and like young adult is 16 to 17, and that 14 to 15 kind of gets lost. But I wanted to write a 15-year-old protagonist, and so I decided to throw caution to the wind and I would do it anyway. And so I proceeded with that, and it was like a bit of a difficult point in the book. So I did that. I submitted it to my agent when I had finished the book, and she was kind of she wasn't sure what to do with it because of that age category. So a suggestion she had was like, what if we tried doing third person? That went very badly. I did not do a good job at that. I don't even want to talk about it. And then she was like, what if we tried doing it as a middle grade? And so then I decided that I was going to try and make it a middle grade book. And quite frankly, that just went very poorly. I don't find that like it just didn't work as a middle grade voice. I tried to do it, it didn't really work. And so we were at this kind of like no man's land of like, it wasn't quite working as a YA voice, it wasn't quite working as a middle grade voice, and I quite honestly just became frustrated with it and I just didn't want to do it anymore. And so I was like, nope, forget it, I'm not gonna do it, I'm gonna shelve it, let's move on from this. My agent did actually want to work on it more, like get it into better shape, but I was just like, I was tired at that point, I was done, I didn't want to do it anymore. And I feel like now that I've had space from that project and I think about it, there's kind of multiple reasons why I don't think I would go back to this. For one, I just don't think that I have a knack for high fantasy. I feel like high fantasy is just kind of not my bag. I feel like I really am an urban or contemporary fantasy girl, and I just don't think I have a knack for high fantasy. And I really felt like when it came to the kind of Caribbean inspired elements of it and me trying to put it in, it just felt kind of piecemeal, and like it wasn't really coming together in a way that felt I guess kind of properly representative of my culture. It just like felt very all over the place, and I think that's because I don't understand how to do high fantasy, and I don't think I'm great at it. I did end up trying to remake this and rejig it for a short story, and then as I talked about when I talked about it kind of writing updates, that short story anthology kind of that deal ended up falling through, and I decided not to continue forward with it, and so I kind of, in my mind, I've really fully shelved this. I feel like there was a lot that I liked about it. I liked the kind of like animal companion connection thing, and maybe that's something I could do in a future book, but maybe not. I think I just don't kind of know where to go from it. I think I really, really liked the main character. I really liked the kind of like spunkiness of her, and I liked that she was funny, but I feel like I've kind of done that with my main character of A Mastery of Monsters. I feel like I've kind of pulled that in a certain way, and so I feel like that's kind of enough for me. I just don't at this time picture myself ever returning to that project. Monster in the Mirror was a YA horror about a girl that goes to fat camp and encounters a doppelganger, and shit goes down, essentially. I worked on this one from April to about August 2020, doing like most of the work in that August 2020 period, and I didn't finish this. I did plotting. I plotted most of it. I didn't plot all of it. I plotted kind of like to about, like, I want to say like bad guys close it, save the cat, kind of like 2/3 of it I had plotted, and I did a synopsis and a pitch letter, and I wrote the first 3 chapters of this book, and so that was kind of like the bulk of the work that I did on it, or rather all of the work that I did on it. So what went wrong? To be quite frank and honest, I do feel that I kind of triggered myself. I wanted to do this very intense deep dive into diet culture and disordered eating patterns and fat phobia, and I wanted to really get into it. And I think it was just like, it was too far into it, that I like felt like I was being pulled back into places I have been previously in my life, just too hard. It was too intense. It was too specific. There was a lot of discussion. It was just like, it was very much in that mindset. There was a lot of discussion about things like calorie counting and restriction, and it was so much and I didn't realize how kind of unequipped I was to write from that intense a perspective. I couldn't do it. And so that was really why I ended up shelving it. I don't even know that I got around to talking about this project on the channel. I had just kind of like had the idea of it, and I started kind of working on it. And yeah, I just feel like it was too intense for me. And so that's kind of where things went wrong, essentially. I don't know that I would return to this project for kind of a number of reasons, and not just kind of like that triggering aspect of it, but also kind of, I don't know that the concept itself is something that I like so much anymore. I think I really wanted to do the doppelganger thing, and that's what I was really like interested in. I don't know if there's a different way to do it, and I do think that there is like a place for the sort of intensity of the subject matter in this book, and I think especially for a teen audience. And I think when I originally shelved it, I was like, I'm never gonna come back to this. Like, I really just don't have the wherewithal to do this. But as I think of it more, I am interested in it. And I had another idea, which I talked about earlier this year, in like writing projects I wanted to work on, about like a a novella project that was like of the similar theme. And so I do think there is some point in which I do want to be able to do that to that level of intensity. I just don't know when and where and with which project. But I will say that I was able to, like, to the level that I feel comfortable with discussing, I was able to take some of those topics and discussions and put some of that into a Mastery of Monsters, which I'm really excited about having been able to do. I think originally I was kind of like on the fence because I think I just like got in my head about like, I didn't want someone to be turned off from the book. I think because when you think of like fat representation in books, I know people really want a lot of like very positive, like I'm super happy with everything and everything is perfect sort of representation. And I wanted to do something that was a little bit more flawed. And I think I worried about how that might come off or if people would be upset at that sort of representation. But I think the thing about representation is you need all kinds of representation. You can't just have one type. You need that full spectrum. And I feel like what I've been able to put into a Mastery of Monsters is like in between like full positivity and like very being in it, in that kind of like the worst kind of place you can be. It's like a medium in between that, but I think one day I would like to go all the way to the other side and be able to explore that in my writing. But I don't know how that will come together, and I don't know that it'll come together in the exact form of this particular project. The Building was a YA sci-fi thriller, and it followed a kind of sci-fi world in which everybody lives in buildings. I hadn't really fully worked it out, but everybody lives in buildings, and a girl is found dead, and the question is, did she fall, did someone push her, or did she jump? And like a bunch of, you know, whodunit thriller things, question mark. You can tell by me struggling to even put this into a synopsis form that I did not have a lot of understanding of what I was doing. But I worked on this in October to November 2020. This was supposed to be my November 2020 NaNoWriMo project. And it didn't really go to plan. So I fully plotted this and I did the first kind of like 6 chapters, I want to say. And then I just stopped working on it. I just wasn't really into it. I think that was the problem. And I think this started because I saw that NaNoWriMo was coming up and I had spare time and I was like, I gotta write a new book. I want to do something for NaNoWriMo. And I just like cobbled this together very quickly, and it just kind of, it showed. When I went to write it, I wasn't really motivated to work on it. I wasn't really interested in it. Even when I'm thinking back on it now, I can barely remember what this book was about or what I was doing. I just kind of, you know, I was making an attempt at a thriller, but it wasn't really working out. And it just altogether, I think, was kind of a little bit of a mess. And I got distracted. I had shiny new idea syndrome. And this is actually the idea that distracted me was for a Mastery of Monsters, which is my 2025 YA Dark Academia Fantasy that I've talked about previously in this video. And I ended up just working on world building for that instead. Yeah, I think I just wasn't really motivated. I think because I had time, I figured I should do a nano thing, and I wasn't really into it. I think this is one of those cases in which I was working on an idea without being as passionate about it as I should have been, and I think that's why I couldn't push myself through to actually get to the end of it. And this is one of those projects where I just fully, I'm like, no, nothing. I don't think I don't think the concept of it is even that interesting. It's really the 1000th floor. The Thousandth Floor has already done the future society living in buildings thing, and so I don't really need to do it. And I could do it in like my own way with my own spin on it, which I think is what I thought I was doing, but I don't see that vision anymore, and so I don't see myself ever returning to this. 6 Days and 5 Nights was an adult horror thriller. It was about a group that goes on a work trip and encounter deadly doppelgangers. And I worked on this from March 2021 to June 2021. And in that May to June period, I attempted a rewrite of the novel. So March to April, I had one draft, and then I attempted a rewrite shortly thereafter from May to June. And I believe this was my attempt to try and do doppelgangers again after the Monster in the Mirror failure. And I do still want to do doppelgangers, but I'll talk about that a little bit more later. So what went wrong with this, I think, was like a combination of things. I think similarly to, I guess, Monster in the Mirror, it was kind of like too close to a real lived experience. I think, as a reminder, in 2020, I was laid off from my marketing job because of COVID and all the things to do with that. And so I felt like in 2021, when I was working on this project, I feel like I was trying to work through a lot of the feelings of having worked in marketing. And so I thought this would kind of like encompass a lot of that. And I would do it with this like horror thriller twist. I even set it in Thailand, where I went on a work trip in Thailand. And I was just gonna I was trying to make that balance, because I always have this balance with books in which I want to pull on my experiences, but I also want to do it from the point of view of the character and that sort of journey, and like do something different. So the stories I'm creating are never like my story or my life. They're just aspects of my life that I've pulled out and I've incorporated into the story. And I think this is just one of the cases in which it was like a little too close. Like I just kind of felt like I was writing like a gripe novel. Like I feel like I was just when you do like a Glassdoor exit interview but you're in the heat of it. I just felt like that's what the book was. It was just like a giant like Glassdoor exit interview, output of a lot of my feelings. And it was just like, it was boring. It was boring. It felt so boring when I just thought about it, and I was writing it, and I was reading bits back, and just everything was so boring. And just, it had the feel of a rant that nobody cares about. And it just it wasn't good. It wasn't good. And I finished writing the book, and I immediately hated it. And I don't have any memory of ever finishing a book and having that feeling of just instantaneously despising it. And that was how I felt about 6 Days and 5 Nights. I couldn't stand it. I thought it was terrible. I thought it was boring and played out and unoriginal, and just it wasn't good. And so that's why I immediately went into this rewrite. And so I went into the rewrite. It was no longer set at Thailand. In Thailand, I just figured the most I could separate myself from my own lived experience, the better it was going to be. And so I just ripped it right from that. And I set it in very randomly. I can't even remember where I set it. I feel like I set it near Whistler in BC. I have no idea. I just picked a random snowy place, and I tried to redo it. And I just as I was writing it, I was just this isn't working. This isn't working. It isn't coming together. I'm not and I felt like I was falling back into some of the pitfalls of it. Like I felt that once again, it was boring. It felt like that rant, it felt like the Glassdoor exit interview, and I wasn't a fan of it. And so, yeah, it just kind of felt like I was writing 2 books about my gripes with my experience in marketing. And I didn't care for it. And so, yeah, I ended up shelving it. And I do believe it'll stay there. The only thing about it that I'm like, oh, I'll take this into future projects is the doppelganger thing. I still want to do a doppelganger book so badly. I still want to do one. I just haven't figured out how to do it or how I want to do it. I do have one idea for an adult thriller with the doppelganger thing, and I do think there's promise in that, but that's in the future. So I think that's the only thing I would pull from this project, is just wanting to do doppelgangers. The Newlyweds was an adult horror thriller about a couple that decide to do a trial period tryout of a home that they are hoping to purchase and end up becoming the victims of a home invasion. And I worked on this from June 2021 to February 2022. In June, I did the plotting and I fast drafted it. I have a whole vlog that I will link down below about writing the book in a week. Yeah, I just plowed right through and I did that. And then I worked on some revisions. I did end up sending it to my agent, and then ultimately I sent it to both beta readers actually and my agent, and ended up ultimately deciding to shelve it. You may remember that I talked about the Newlyweds previously, but I'm going to talk about that when I get to the future plans bit. So, yes. So what went wrong with this? And I think the big thing about this is the midpoint twist and kind of the encapsulation of the story. That is what I couldn't make work. And that is where things went wrong. And so I feel like the book was really fun. It was really fast paced. It was really exciting. But the thing that, and my agent pointed this out, which was very helpful to me, which was that the midpoint changed everything. And so I can't remember if I've spoiled this on this channel before, but I'll say it to you now because I'm not going to do it anymore. But the midpoint twist was that they were in a simulation. So that was the shift of the book. You thought all of this was happening, and then you learned that they were in a simulation. And to me, this was like to me like a sort of homage to Cabin in the Woods. Like I wanted that sort of like heavy midpoint shift that like changes everything that you thought about what came before. But the difference, and I think this is what Cabin in the Woods succeeds at, and which I failed at, is that Cabin in the Woods, the movie, these are real stakes. So there's a big shift in the middle, but the real stakes of it don't change. And that was what I had a problem with the Newlyweds, is that once you knew it was a simulation, everything that came before those stakes disappeared because you were aware that they were not actually, that things were being created. So the things that were happening were things that were being created for the simulation. And so those characters, like their journeys, it completely changed that, and it really kind of like dunked on the stakes. And I tried to like fix it and like making it that like, you know, the like if you die in the game, you die in real life, but it just kind of wasn't doing it. And I think, and that was just like the crux of the issues with it. And to me, taking out that simulation portion, made the whole thing not even worth it. Like taking out the simulation made the idea and the whole book not interesting to me anymore. But leaving the simulation, I couldn't make it work. And it's just like, yeah, I couldn't make any of that work. And it was just clear to me that I was going to have to just do a completely new story. And so that is what happened. So I rewrote this, which it doesn't really resemble in any way the book anymore. What I basically did is I plucked out the characters and like their relationship dynamics and relationship issues, and I pulled that into a different book, and that book became Pathways, which I have edited and is like kind of just about ready to be put on submission to publishers. So that's very exciting. So yeah, this is a case in which I couldn't make that idea work, and I was able to make the rewrite work in this case, which was rough for me to do because as you saw before, I wrote 6 Days and 5 Nights. I decided I hated it. I tried to rewrite it. It didn't work. I wrote this one and I was like, okay, this is better, but then I couldn't make it work. And so then I had to do a rewrite, and you know, it was kind of like, is it going to work this time? And thankfully, I feel like it did work out. How submission goes will be a completely separate beast and completely separate thing, but that is what I ended up doing with this story. And finally, the horror trio. This is about a series, a trilogy rather, of young adult horror novels, all taking place in Toronto over 24 hours, that would be interconnected. So they would be related to each other, but you wouldn't have to read one of the other books to read like the newest books, for example. It'd be more like kind of Easter egg kind of connections sort of thing, and it would come together in a third book. So if you read all 3 of the books, you get the full journey, but you didn't have to. They could stand alone. And I talk about this as like the trilogy because that's what I was pitching. So I pitched this as a trilogy to my publisher, and I did a proposal, and the proposal was focused on the first book in the series, which is about a group of friends that have kind of had a falling out, but they come back together when the sister of one of the friends who used to babysit them all wins kind of night out in Toronto sort of thing, and they all go downtown to celebrate, and things go awry. So yeah, or rather you could say shit goes down. Either or works. And so I worked on this from January of 2023 to March of 2023. In March of 2023, we sent the proposal to my publisher to see if they'd be interested in purchasing it. And so that was kind of everything I put together. So I put together a synopsis, a pitch letter, a brief description of the other 2 books and what they would be and kind of how they were connected to each other. And then the first 6 chapters, which I think was like the first kind of 50 pages sort of thing. Or was it more than that? It was the first 6 chapters in any case. And so that was everything that we had put together and sent off to the publisher. So what went wrong? So what went wrong really was that my publisher was hesitant about kind of the performance of my horror novels. And so it was kind of just going to be an offer for 1 book as opposed to all 3. And I decided instead of going forward with that what I wanted to do is I very quickly created a proposal for a Mastery of Monsters, which is my 2025 YA Dark Academia fantasy. I feel like I'm coming back to a Mastery of Monsters a lot. I feel like there is a large thread of a Mastery of Monsters through these projects. But in any case, I ended up pitching that instead, and that is what we sold and went forward with. And basically that meant that the horror trio then became kind of automatically shelved. And so that's where it sits right now. Future plans for it. I do still want to come back to this, but I do think I want to do a little bit of overhauling. I think when I have the space and distance from it and I look back at the project now, I do feel like it was rushed. Let me back up. So really what I had planned to submit to my publisher originally was a Mastery of Monsters. That's what I was going to submit. But when I finished a Mastery of Monsters the year before, I didn't feel like it was any good. I thought it was like not well put together. And I still love the idea, but I needed time to work on it. I didn't feel like I had enough time to kind of get it into shape for submitting to my publisher, submitting to any publisher. But I financially, in order to continue my life and writing full time, I needed to sell something. And so I was in this time crunch of like, I was going to rely on A Mastery of Monsters as like selling that as a next project, but I could no longer do that. And then I didn't have anything. And then I was panicking and I was like, I need to put something together. And so I like put this project together. But I don't think that I gave it the time and space that it needed. I think looking back on it, I can feel that I was rushing. I can feel that I was kind of like panicked about needing to sell something. And I feel like I could do so much better than I did. And that's kind of my feeling. And so really, I do want to return to this project because I think there's so much that's like really cool about it, but I think I would have to do it in a different way. I don't know if I would still do the interconnected trio thing, because I do feel like, and something that my publisher brought up that I did think was legitimate, which was that even though they can technically be read as standalones, people will view it as a trilogy. And then you get yourself into that kind of like series trap of now it's a series. And like that becomes more difficult to pitch to publishers. And so part of me is interested in just like overhauling this whole thing and like still pitching it as a trilogy, and like going forward with that and kind of just like fixing and tweaking things, certainly replotting that entire first book, because I do think it could be more fast-paced. I think it could be more twisty. I think it could be a lot more interesting than what I put together. I think all the character journeys are very good and very interesting, but I think the plot of it, I think I could do way better than I did, taking more time with it. And so I definitely feel like there's something there. But also part of me, there's one of the books in the trilogy where I'm kind of like, or should I just pull that one out completely and like make it an adult thriller and pitch it like in that way as an adult thriller, like depending on how things with my career adult in that adult age category go. And so I kind of like am of many minds of what to do with the horror trio. I'm not 100% sure, but I do want to do something with that whole idea and those books that I kind of had planned, because I do think there's a lot of great stuff in there. So I'm not really sure. So I don't know whether I'd still pitch it as the 3 books or whether I'd pull books out and just do them as full standalones. I have no idea, but there's something there, but also I know that there was some element of rushing. I think I have the space from it now to be like, yeah, this like could have been better than it was. So yeah, that's my feelings about the horror trio. And that's it for all of those shelved projects. I don't think I realized myself how many there were. I know that I shelve a lot of things, but I don't think I realized the total breadth of it. But I feel like for me, the big learning of going through all of this is that it is so hard to pick like the so-called right idea. And for me, writing is so exploratory. And so I pick out that idea that I'm passionate about, but you can see that sometimes I get distracted by other things. I got distracted by wanting to participate in NaNoWriMo, and I got distracted by like needing to sell something. And so that kind of ended up with me kind of like pulling in a project, trying to do it, a little bit faster than I think I should have. So sometimes that played into it, but for the most part, I do try and pick ideas that I'm the most passionate about, but sometimes it just doesn't work out. But all of those ideas I thought were going to become published books, or like I had a hope of them becoming published books. And so you know, I always like had that hope for an idea. And so I just feel like it's really hard to know how an idea is going to develop as a novel, and you kind of just have to try it out. And I also feel like all of those projects, even though they were shelved, they weren't wastes of time. In most of those cases, there was something about them that I could find, that I could pick out, that I could put forward into another book. A lot of it seemed to go into A Mastery of Monsters, but I found different things that I was able to pull, that I was excited about, that I could put forward into future projects. I learned about different things. And so, you know, all of those times when I had to shelve those projects, I was often very frustrated or very annoyed or very upset. Like, I never shelved anything with joy. And I think that's why I call it like revisiting my past failures. Not just because it's a good clickbaity title, but also like during those times it felt like that. It always felt kind of like a failure. It felt like giving up. It felt like I wasn't able to do it. And it's really only in hindsight that I can be like, yeah, I was glad that things worked out that way. I was able to find a different way around it. And so I like get being annoyed in choosing an idea and like not having it come to fruition and like being upset and like having to shelve something. But in hindsight, I'm able to look at all those things and be kind of glad and to see the different journeys that those projects have had. And some of those projects, of course, I still want to get back to in some way. And I feel like, you know, having talked so much about A Mastery of Monsters in this video, which I didn't expect to be doing, but I think about that first project, that first novel I'd written, and like how crushing that was to me. Like, I really like, to me, I gave up on writing. After that didn't go my way. I gave up. I was done. The fact that I found my way back to it was its own sort of like happy surprise. But to me in that moment, I was finished with it. And to think about like the things that I've taken into A Mastery of Monsters and like that going to be its own published novel and like being excited about that now feels so much like, oh wow, like that. Like, it's wild to think of that journey is really what I'm getting at. So yeah, shelved books, but I feel like there was so much that I was able to take from each of those. And so I feel like that just for me reiterates how much of like a journey and an exploration writing is. But anyway, I digress. We'll finish with that. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed already, please subscribe. And thank you so much for watching. Bye!